the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, pink elephants turn out to be insane creatures from Gleis 229 who imagine planet Earth into being while in their cups. Drunks warned not to cross them or will wink out of existence in a poof. E-arcs and summer larks lead to adventure in the stars.
Plus, we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Alliance of Equals by Sharon Lee and Steve Miller, all right now.
Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. I'm Baen Senior Editor Toni Daniel. Hey, we have a new Baen intern with us today, Jonathan Grauberd. You've done a few things this week already. You're not just in. How's it been so far, and where are you coming from?
It's been a little bit terrifying, and I am coming from Maryland, St. John's, but a bit further back in origin. I come from Israel.
Cool. So you came over here to go to college. You also came before that and lived several years, right?
Mm-hmm. I spent a few years when I was a teenager in Connecticut, actually. And then I went back to Israel, did my 3 years of the IDF, and I came back to do college here.
And you went to St. John's, the great book school. How was that? Did you like it?
I did. Hurt my brain a lot, but I learned, grew as a person. Got an education, which I suppose is what college is about. Maybe.
Seems, yeah. You might be getting your education this summer here of a different sort. So, well, welcome aboard, and we'll be hearing more from Jonathan on the podcast as well. This time, we have an interview with Steve White and Charles E. Gannon, Chuck Gannon, who discussed their new entry in the Starfire series, Oblivion. Oblivion brings a rousing finale to this portion of the series, with a last stand against alien hordes and lots of courage and tactical brilliance on display. It's a fun book. Plus, there are great character moments therein. We'll talk all about this with Steve and Chuck. And along for the discussion is special guest Toni Weisskopf, who is Baen publisher and my boss. Plus, we have Jonathan was sitting in on this interview when we did it yesterday to learn the podcast ropes a bit. So it's a great, entertaining interview we have for you coming up. What else do we have coming up, Jonathan?
And we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Sharon Lee and Steve Miller's Liaden Universe novel, Alliance of Equals.
Excellent. Now here's the news. The May E-arcs are here. Now, an E-arc is the sound a rabbit makes when it realizes it's bitten a carrot that is actually an invading alien vampire from the vegan dimension. Fortunately, rabbit bites are inevitably fatal to vegan vampiric invaders, so they haven't become a noticeable nuisance to gardeners yet. No. That is not what an E-arc is. An E-arc is actually an advanced reading copy in electronic form. These are early versions of our books that are coming out in a few months, and we will sell them to you with the edits in, but the proofreading not done, which can make for a few interesting moments while reading. But generally, what we give you is your favorite author's latest, weeks in advance, sometimes months in advance, usually months in advance. This month we have Avalanche, the new Secret World Chronicle entry by Mercedes Lackey, Cody Martin, Dennis Lee, and Veronica Giguere. Tell us about that, Jonathan.
Well, Ultima Thule has been destroyed. But now the Thulians have mounted an even bigger force to destroy Metis. The Metisians have escaped the carnage and destruction of their secret city, now must find somewhere safe to go, without being snapped up by the various world governments. You could say things can't get worse. You would be wrong. Red de Ginny's past is about to catch up with him, so is Victoria Victrix's. The heroes of Echo and the heroes of CCCP have to save the world. But first they have to save each other, and the Avalanche has begun.
Hey, also out in New York is Worlds 2 by Eric Flint. Hey, this is a great short story collection by a master teller of tales. Known for his New York Times best-selling alternate history novels, Flint is equally a master of shorter forms, and this second large volume that we've put out gathers more of Flint's shorter works, including several stories and a short novel set in Flint's celebrated Ring of Fire alternate history series. In addition to the fiction, Eric Flint has written an overall introduction, plus an introduction for each story, telling how it came to be written, making this an irresistible book for the many thousands of Eric Flint fans. That e-arc is out. And finally out in e-arc is Alternate Routes by Tim Powers. Hey, this is a good one. The ghosts of the LA freeway system are rising up. Something weird is happening to the Los Angeles freeways. Phantom cars, lanes from nowhere, and sometimes unmarked off-ramps that give glimpses of a desolate desert highway. Sebastian Vickery, ex-Secret Service agent, is a driver for a covert supernatural evasion car service. This whole concept is really cool in the book. But another government agency is using and perhaps causing the freeway anomalies, and their chief is determined to have Vickery killed because of something he learned years ago at a halted presidential motorcade. Reluctantly aided by Ingrid Castine, a member of that agency, Vickery learns what legendary hell it is that the desert highway leads to. And when Castine deliberately drives into it to save him from capture, he must enter it himself to get her out. Alternate Routes is a fast-paced supernatural adventure story that sweeps from the sun-blinded streets and labyrinthine freeways of Los Angeles to a horrifying other world out of Greek mythology. This is a really good one, and it is out in e-arc right now. Avalanche by Mercedes Lackey, Cody Martin, Dennis Lee, and Veronica Giguere. Whirls 2 by Eric Flint, and Alternate Routes by Tim Powers are all available now in e-arc form exclusively at Baen eBooks. Check them out. Want to welcome Steve White and Charles E. Gannon to the podcast. Hello, guys.
Hello.
Hi, Tony.
We also have along my boss, Toni Weisskopf, today here in the office. Hi, Toni.
Hi, podcast listeners.
And we have Baen intern, Jonathan Grauberd, who is joining us for the summer. He's going to be our summer intern. He'll be helping out on the podcast in various ways, I expect as well.
Hi, everyone.
Vietnam veteran Steve White is the author of numerous science fiction and fantasy novels, including Wolf Among the Stars, St. Anthony's Fire, Blood of Heroes, and in the Jason Thanow series. There's a lot that we could say that Steve did, and we would be going forever and ever. He's also the co-author of Exodus, the immediate prequel to Extremis, and Oblivion, which we'll be talking about today. With David Weber, Steve collaborated on the Starfire series novels Insurrection, Crusade, and Deathground, and the Shiva option as well. So he's been along on all the Starfire series. Charles E. Gannon is the author of Compton Crook award-winning Nebula-nominated Fire with Fire, Trial by Fire, Raising Cain, and Cain's Mutiny in the Cain Riordan series. He is the co-author with Eric Flint of 1636, The Papal Stakes, and Commander Cantrell in the West Indies in Eric Flint's best-selling Ring of Fire series. We have a Papal Stakes sequel out, right?
Yes, you do. The Vatican sanctions.
The Vatican sanctions, yes. That slipped my mind momentarily. With Steve White, Chuck is the co-author of the Starfire series novels Extremis and Imperative, and the author of multiple short stories, member of Sigma, the SF think tank, which has advised various intelligence and defense agencies since the start of the this millennium. Chuck lives near Annapolis, Maryland, with his wife and children. Steve lives in Charlottesville, Virginia. So everybody's somewhere in the mid-Atlantic region there.
We are tidewater creatures.
That's right. Yes.
Well, and Jonathan, our intern, just got done with 4 years at St. John's in Annapolis, right, Jonathan?
Yes, sir. 4 years in the bubble.
Yeah. Now we're teaching him all sorts of strange things that are alarming to him, but that's life. Well, out now at booksellers everywhere is Oblivion, which is a Starfire novel by Steve White and Charles E. Gannon. It's part of this great ongoing, it's like 25 years old now, I think, New York Times best-selling series. Good stuff. So tell us where we are in the series. What's the situation at the start of Oblivion so we can maybe get our discussion set up?
Well, the stage was set for Oblivion in Imperative, which is part of this story arc within the Starfire universe that started with Exodus and Extremis. And just as a convenience label, I'm going to call all this the Exodus story arc. And to sum it up as briefly as possible, what happens in this story arc is that you have an alien race, the Arduans, who are fleeing from a supernova that's going to make their home planet uninhabitable. And what they're fleeing in are humongous, slower-than-light generation ships. Now, this comes as a shock to the humans and other associated races once the Arduans enter their space, because the humans and their friends and other associates have always traveled between the stars using warp points, which allow instantaneous transit from one point to another. And nobody has ever even tried to go STL. So this, of course, completely obviates the whole strategic picture based on the warp point network. It's as if the entire sky has turned into one vast warp point. You just don't know where the bad guys are going to be coming from. Now, what happens in Exodus and Extremis is that the first wave of these generation ships fight a war with the humans and their allies, which is eventually resolved, and this first wave of Arduan immigrants has settled in more or less amicably. However, unbeknownst to everybody, they're following behind this first wave are other diasporas of Arduans, and these have been taken over by a faction which, for reasons we'll go into later, considered the first group that has reached an accommodation with the humans, regards them as traitors and heretics who are fit for extermination, along with the humans. And this
no
attitude on their
contemporary
part,
resonance is there.
yes, and this just a bit, and this attitude on their part is not to be taken lightly, because number one, they've broken up some of their generation ships into kinetic projectiles, which swept through human space at relativistic velocities, smashing into planets, which of course doesn't do the planet or its inhabitants a bit of good. They also have, in addition to all the devastation wreaked by this, they also have a new weapon, the relativistic acceleration weapon, or RAW, which, using the principles of quantum entanglement, can materialize particles within a target with 100% conversion into energy inside the target, which of course ruins your whole day. So
this has obviated or caused the super dreadnoughts, the big ships that humans have developed, to be essentially useless now, right?
Yes. You see, the now you're. I have to correct your terminology here. The super dreadnought, what it is, originally in the Starfire universe, which is, as you know, is based on a game system. The super dreadnought was the biggest warship. Now, it has been found over the course of the development of the Starfire universe that in space warfare, size matters. And larger warships have been developed over the course of all these novels. It sort of goes back to the old showbiz adage, if you're going to have a circus, you got to have elephants. And so naturally for subsequent circuses, you got to have bigger elephants. And so in the course of my novels with Dave Weber, they developed something called the Monitor, which was bigger than the Super Dreadnought, and then the Super Monitor. And then in Exodus and Extremis, they developed the Devastator, which was bigger still, and finally the Super Devastator, which was widely believed to be invincible.
Because everything you order can be supersized. The Super Devastator was regarded as invincible. Now, I'm sure I'm not really giving anything away when I say that, in the words of Mammy Yoakum, it ain't necessarily so.
Yeah, I mean, you can see why this series is so much fun. It's got all the fun military science fiction, all the scope of great space opera, and the sly humor of Steve and Chuck.
Right. Yes. Yes. I'm afraid that I'm not going to name names, but I'm afraid all too much military science fiction seems to consist of one grubby little infantry squad stuck in the jungle on planet Vietnam. Although some of the stuff I've read more recently, I thought I'd give it another try, so I read something more recent, and sure enough, we had one grubby little infantry squad stuck in the desert on planet Afghanistan. And there's nothing inherently wrong with stories like this, of course. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying there's anything there is. I just think it's unnecessarily self-limiting, because the great thing about science fiction is that you can really deal with high concepts and vast scope and just about anything you want to do.
Well, the other part of the Starfire universe, of course, is the alien races, and the fun you guys have with dealing with not just first contact, but many different contacts.
Yes, yes. Now, I am the first to admit that it is somewhat implausible that you would have a situation like we have in the Starfire series, in which over and over again our heroes encounter a new alien race which is more or less at exactly the same technological level it is at. This is I admit this is a low probability event, but you got to do it if you want to have a war rather than merely an annexation.
Well, I mean, that's, again, we're getting to, you guys are playing with essentially real-world rules. You are trying to keep to as hard science as you possibly can.
As we possibly can, given the fact that, as you know, this was based on a game system, the Starfire game system, which originally came out in the year 1979. And Dave Weber and I were both Starfire players, and this is how we eventually met and started writing fiction together. But we had to work within the constraints of the Starfire game system, which made it rather challenging. Actually, it sort of reined us in. It kept us honest in a way, because we had to stay within these parameters. And some of these parameters were, well, they involved things that made Starfire eminently playable, but
not eminently plausible.
but required us to give up certain laws of physics.
Yeah, but you guys you do have your alien species, and the humans have relative disadvantages that they use initiative and a lot of thoughtfulness and a lot of cleverness to overcome. So it's not exactly like they're perfect equals. In fact, the fun of the books is how you have them think through these problems, especially the technological issues that they encounter.
It enables to set up some genuine tactical problems, some some genuine R&D strategies that the protagonist races have to go through. For example, you've already dealt with one example of that, the fact that the Super Devastator becomes obsolete because of the cartoony RAW, the relativistic acceleration weapon, because the thing of it is, this is totally devastating, materializing things within the target, but the targeting is such that it can only be used against the big ships. So the big ships all of a sudden become big and slow. They suddenly, yes, and so the big slow ships become death traps, and which is unfortunate for our heroes, because the big slow ships are armed with something called the gravitic disruptor, or G-beam, which is a nasty weapon, but it can be used at its maximum effectiveness by a ship with a really big, powerful engine.
Well, maybe we should. All right, so we've got sort of the scope. Maybe we could talk about the characters a little, because they are. I think that you both handle different main characters. There's two basic plot lines, storylines in here. The first of these is Ian Trevain, and the other one is Ossian Weathermere. Can we talk a little bit about Ian first? Who is he? Who was he? Because this guy's been around. He's got a family at stake now too, all kind of things, and he's quite a character.
Well, okay. 80 years before the Exodus story arc begins, we had the Fringe Revolution, which broke up the old Terran Federation into the Terran Republic and the human component of what is rather exaggeratedly called the Pansentient Union. Now, in this war, Trevain, who was in his 40s at the time, was the big hero of the war on the loyalist side. Eventually, he, in a battle with his arch enemy, Liaden, who was the big hero on the rebel side, he is not quite killed, but the only way they keep him alive is by a quick and dirty cryogenic freeze from which he cannot be brought out without killing him. So for he spends 80 years getting, as he himself puts it, well and truly freezer burned, at the end of which time they finally come up with a technique by which they can produce an anencephalic clone of him and transfer his brain into that. So so he achieves a kind of resurrection. And this happens, so all of a sudden his good old brain is inside this 20-year-old body. Now, as it happens, this occurs at about
That's
the
what
same
we do
time
with the interns around here when they're done, by the way.
Oh, really?
We just scoop them out and put our...
Watch your six, John.
But anyway,
jokes on them. I gotta.
So Trevain comes back in time to lead against the Arduans in the course of Exodus and Extremis. And in the course of this, now of course this involves a certain adjustment on his part. For example, his old lover is now about 150 years old and has numerous grown children. And his old arch enemy, Liaden, is still around, and he ends up falling in love with Liaden's daughter and eventually marries her.
She goes missing in the last book, and in Imperative. But it is true, and he, aside from being a legendary figure from the Fringe Revolution, there's a kind of mythic resonance involved in the fact that he comes back to life just in time, just so when the Arduans arrive, sort of like King Arthur coming back when England needs him. And between all of that and plus the fact that he's a tactical genius, they really need him, but he's all too willing to risk his own life. And I don't want to go into all the details, but basically his wife, Lee Magda, so sort of a benign mutiny by which she essentially takes the bullet for him, but it's not certain that she's dead. And they have a 6-year-old daughter with a wonderful name, Han.
Yes. As somebody remarks in the story, it's Han Trevain. This is as somebody in the story remarks, this is sort of like a kid named Hatfield McCoy. But anyway, the problem with Han is at the time of Oblivion, she's been brought to Earth, which was believed to be a safer location for her, which turns out to be not the case at all. In fact, she's right in the crosshairs, and this, of course, is another complication for Trevain.
Some of the my funnest parts of the book are when Trevain gives these speeches to the he sort of like ship-wide announcements, and I feel roused by them. I want to go out and fight with this guy. Is it fun to write those speeches? Is this a Steve or a Chuck part, or do you both do these together?
Trevain is all Steve. As a matter of fact, you can talk about almost any character, and it's pretty much one. It belongs to one or the other of us.
No, that's right. That's the way
Keeps
we
things
wrote
tidy.
Yeah, but well, when Dave Weber and I were writing the original novels of this series, I was running Baen and he was running Lee Han, and so this got tense. But
you were enemies. Wow.
But as for Train's speeches, I did try to make him wax Churchillian at the beginning of Oblivion. I did this for two reasons. First of all, I wanted to convey as best I could the fact that he's a very charismatic figure. And as I say, there's this mythic resonance about him at this particular stage in his life or lives. And also I wanted to use his speech to bring the reader up to date on the background in a relatively painless way. Basically, he reviews the situation. And finally, I wanted to use this rather Churchillian speech to underline the sheer desperation of the situation at the beginning of Oblivion. I mean, the human race has its back to the wall.
Several points in the narrative where he rallies the troops like that, and it's really effective. And it's always a moment of mistiness for those of us who like such things. Maybe we could talk a little bit about Ossian now and bring in Chuck some more. Who came up with him, and tell us a little bit more about him.
So Ossian was the story of how Steve and I came to work together, or rather, I should say, conceived of it before we got greenlit by Toni in that very room. Is that for a period of time, Steve was, shall we say, he was uncertain how the original start on Extremis was with a different collaborator, and it was uncertain how that was going to work out. So ultimately, it happily fell to me. It was the first novel I ever wrote. It was a grand experience. I couldn't ask for a better collaborator who has become a person about whom I can say I couldn't ask for a better friend. And that happened very quickly because, you see, before we ever wrote together, we drank bourbon together. This is a wonderful
fact. Entirely unrelated.
So at any rate, this completely unnecessary foundation for what came next was nonetheless in place. And when we took a look at what was there, it was pretty clear that Steve had already written a number of chapters which were perfect, because this was a novel that was going to take place essentially in two or more theaters of action, and up till that point, Steve's focus had been on one or two of those locations, which were conveniently located fairly far away from the ones that I was going to wind up picking up. So I sat down and I said, what sort of character do I want to write? And it struck me that we had one of the things that the series had in great riches were professional military people who had either, whether they were professional through the enlisted or professional through the officer ranks. That was a constant in the series. And I sat there and I said, there are people, because I had a son at this time who was making murmurings about ROTC. So I sort of sat there and I thought, I wonder about the people who come into this through a less direct manner. That maybe they're going to school and they do the equivalent of NOTC. No, there will be no jokes about Nazi as a result of that. Because ROTC, of course, is ROTC, so you can imagine what the naval people have to deal with. And so I said, what about somebody who comes up through that, if you will, line? And the story of Ossian Weathermere, to some degree, is a little bit. I would say, if you want to mix Hornblower's kind of freewheeling and rapid rise with MacGyver, you have a little bit of a sense of who Miles Ossian is, because his approach to situations tends to be, I think the word modestly, the term modestly unconventional is safely an understatement, and that is very much how he evolves over the course of the series, and he doesn't lose that. And some of that, I figure, is because there are, one of the things we see is that he has certain, not coming from that professional military background, sometimes means he has a lot of catching up to do, and that means he and other people pay that price. On the other hand, one of the things you get out of it, in the sense that we have the defects of our virtues and the virtues of our defects, is that he's able to sort of look at a problem, and he doesn't necessarily, he doesn't have, if you will, the preferred and received solution that was learned and drilled into his head, playing in the back of his head the whole time. He kind of comes to things with a sort of fresh view from a different perspective sometimes, which was a lot of fun to play with. It also gave me an opportunity to chip away at something that Steve and I had many discussions about over time, which was the fact, as Steve referred to earlier, that it came from a game which in its initial incarnation, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, had as one of its most powerful propulsive technologies ion drives.
Yes, the ion drive, which you sort of moved along at a given speed, and it could just stop, and it could and it could almost immediately reverse direction and so forth. This is what I meant earlier about giving up certain laws of physics.
So there were some things that were let go. There were other things that seemed like we had an opportunity to maybe, without retconning, show them in detail to explain how they work. One of them was that the series up to this point had been filled with people in space fighters who were experiencing all the sorts of G-force effects that, for instance, you do in an atmosphere. Well, you pretty much don't, particularly if you're in a non-pressurized cockpit and if you're in a vac suit that's completely sealed. You're not going to have any air effect on you. You're not going to feel exactly those same sort of forces. So we found a way to, in fact, portray that. And these sort of things went along over time. We got a little more defined on some of the physics behind the weapon systems. And Ossian, because Ossian was the guy who kept on saying, yeah, but what about this? Because he didn't know any better not to say that. And people look at each other and go, yeah, what about that? Maybe we can do something with that. And this was an opportunity to sort of get in there and fiddle with a couple of the bits under the hood. So he was doing double duty, really.
I really like being able to see what happens when you change the tactical situation for these armies, when you attack their assumptions. Now, of course, you're the authors and you can just do that, but it's nice to see how this is handled on an institutional level, and the different ways it can be handled with the different species and the different organizational structures that you have in this universe.
Yes. Let me go back and interject one thing here. As Ossian is to the Terran military, Chuck has been to the Starfire universe. I cannot compliment him enough for the fresh insights and novel viewpoint he has brought to bear on our good old hoary assumptions.
Ossian is sort of... he reminds me of another certain character I know named Kane Riordan. There's a lot of the same sort of jack of all trades, somebody that operates between insanity and genius, right, Chuck? I would say.
Oh yeah, there's certainly some threads there. Absolutely. The difference, of course, is that Kane starts out completely without. I mean, his military background is as an analyst. You know, he's done the equivalent of interviews in the field and things like that. So Ossian comes far more prepared than he does, and also therefore a slightly more limited cone. But yes, absolutely, Ossian, because he's probably a jack of all trades, also winds up sort of being a liaison in a lot of ways to the Arduins. which becomes a really important thing. And to go to what Toni was just saying about shaking up the paradigms, if you will, of military in general, military science fiction is as related inside the Starfire series, perhaps more broadly. That having that human connection to the Arduins was really interesting because the Arduins represent one of the major introductions of asymmetry into the if you will, the warfighting paradigm in the Starfire universe. Because one of the things I remember, we were sitting down one time, this was early on, and I was talking with Steve, and I said, so Steve, is Selnarm, and I know we're going there eventually, is Selnarm limited by light speed? And Steve looked at me and he said, I don't know. I don't think it would be. And I said, that's really cool. And that's an extraordinary opportunity because their command and control requirements become entirely different than humans who are still limited to speed of light communication. And this creates this situation where, and also their lack of fear of death, which puts, quite frankly, kamikazes look like scared kindergarten kids compared to the Arduins.
The Arduins believe in reincarnation, right?
Right. Yeah. What it is, I came up with the Arduin race a long time ago, back in the 1990s, just as an idea for something that Dave Weber and I might eventually work on. And one of the things about the Arduins that I wanted to emphasize was the fact that there's a fundamental cultural difference between them and us, and that is that on their road to high technology, they never experienced our so-called conflict of science and religion, because their science proved their religion to their satisfaction. They believe in reincarnation with a single-mindedness which is impossible for us to believe in anything. And so they are completely fearless, and a good part of their culture is based on, I'm having a senior moment, I can't remember the Arduin word for it, but basically the recollection of past lives. And this is part of the conflict between the good guy Arduins, or relatively good guy Arduins, the ones of the first diaspora, versus the ones coming after them who have, to a great extent, rejected this, or rejected reliance on it.
Yeah, they're shaken in many ways, and they're like a beehive that somebody hit with a stick, which was that you're not going to live forever. So what is, if we can, the initial situation is that the second wave of Arduins is pushing this horrific arachnid species toward Earth, we think, at least, and they're going to come out at the Alpha Centauri warp point, and that's where Trevain is, and tell us where Trevain and Ossian are at the beginning of the books and what situations they're in, if you tactically.
Well, Trevain at the beginning of the book is on this warp chain leading to Alpha Centauri. What it is, you have to, in the Starfire universe, it is assumed that our solar system is what is called a cul-de-sac system. In other words, it only has one warp point. However, that one warp point leads to another warp point at Alpha Centauri, and Alpha Centauri has 8 of the suckers. So Alpha Centauri becomes the human race's gateway to the galaxy. So the thing is, as Trevain is being forced back toward Alpha Centauri, and once he gets there, then the human race's back is really to the wall, because there's nowhere it can go from Sol. Now the tactical situation in Alpha Centauri that Trevain faces is that the Arduins, driving the arachnids before them, are going to be coming through a warp point at one side of the Alpha Centauri system, and the warp point leading to Sol is on the other side, and they're going to be passing a bunch of other warp points. So Trevain comes up with the idea of using these other warp points as bolt holes. In other words, he sends task groups through these warp points to whatever stars they lead to, and they just wait there. And they can appear as the Arduins. Well, I keep saying Arduins. I should say the Toni, which is what the bad guy Arduins call themselves. Come through there. They can be attacked on the flanks by forces appearing out of these warp points, because you see, it's very paradoxical to go to another. It's easier using the warp network to go to another star than it is to slog across a single solar system. But that's sort of the tactical situation in Alpha Centauri that Trevain faces.
And where is Weathermere at this time?
And so Weathermere has, in the prior novel Imperative, has found there was no. They were essentially in an entirely different salient, and they were essentially peripheral to the complete destruction of the Orions as a force and being, pretty much.
That's one of the other alien races, the Orions.
Felid, they are passed off as Felid, although of course they probably have about as much genetically in common with a terrestrial cat as a cat does with a lobster. Actually, probably a whole lot less.
A whole lot less.
But yeah. But so what we had in the last novel was they realized that they had a way to bring the fleet that was stuck all the way back, where in the primary zone of activity of Extremis, and bring it forward, and that's where Yoshikune's fleet comes in and all that. And this is very much basically what Weathermere has to do and has been doing, is to go on the down low. He has to stay undetected. If he engages the enemy, there can be no report of it. It has to be completely clean and eliminated every time. So he's working through what used to be called the Star Union area, and they are now starting to get. They have at the end. They start this novel, Oblivion, realizing what is happening to Trevain. That Earth is getting beaten up. If you will, the corridor that leads from all like B-15, etc., all the way on up to Alpha Centauri, which of course is going to put them on the doorstep of Earth itself, the Sol system.
So Weathermere is, in a general sense, behind the assault, and Trevain is going to take the brunt of it while Weathermere sort of attacks in the rear, or at least comes up with a plan for how to deal with the Toni back there. Is that a correct assessment?
That is, and much of the tension on the during the passage out of the Star Union is that Yoshikune wants to go on the attack, and we have to get in the game now, and we have to save him, and this, that, and the other thing. But Weathermere's looking at this and says they always keep their raws, their relativistic attack weapons back. Well, if we get in behind them, and if they send he's thinking if they send their essentially their nutcracker into the Sol system from Alpha Centauri, there's going to be a space of time where they have left the RAWs behind them, thinking they're essentially safe with the equivalent of a garrison force. And if we can whack them if we can take them out, then one thing changes in the Sol system. The Devastators and the Super Devastators become the all-important weapons once again, because the giant killers, the Davids in this story, have suddenly been eliminated, and there's a great deal of tension because it is a situation that Weathermere is loath to be the advocate for, because he knows what it means. Every one of those planets, every day that Trevain's fleet is having to essentially hold the many passes of Thermopylae on the way to Earth is hundreds, thousands, millions of lives lost.
Yeah, that's kind of cool. I love the idea of Alpha Centauri being the Thermopylae pass.
Yeah, I was going to ask, are there other real-world analogies and historical precedents you guys were thinking about? World War II or South China Sea tactical situations? What were you thinking?
Well, when you say Arduins and Toni, that's sort of the equivalent of saying Germans and Nazis. And I actually went as far dealing with the Kaituni as to use individual parallels. I mean, their head honcho is more like Hitler, and
everything but that little mustache. I'm telling you.
And one of his chief subordinates is more like Himmler. In other words, the subordinate is the real ideologue. The head honcho is more into power than into ideology.
Chuck, were you thinking about military history at all when you were doing this, or?
It's probably not on the way in because the dynamics of the technology and space are different enough that I'm really thinking more about, in order to write something that feels to me like hard science fiction, I sort of want to immerse myself in that world. But as I went through it, the parallels come up, and I think the parallels come up in the spirit of it, which is, right, yes. A lot of it is, to me, a lot of the kind of ideas that were, well, the relationship, if you will, between the Allies in the West and the Russians in World War II. The Russians kept on saying, relieve us, open the other front. And you've got now Yoshikuni is a little bit like, and probably about the same success, Montgomery. Yes, we're going to get there. We're going to get right in there. We're going to fight. And there were other, or Patton. The if you will, the longer game was, we know they're taking hits, but the bottom line is there will be the best moment. And we have to be sure we take the best moment, because we can wrap this up much more definitively if we wait for it. So there was that tension. There were a lot of the sacrifices on the Eastern Front that came to mind. Some of those battles on the ocean, like in the Coral Sea, turning back, blunting the Japanese advances on Australia. The incredible sacrifices, destroyers running at battleships. I mean, this sort of thing was very much in my mind, along with the guilt of people who were not in the teeth of it, but who felt that pull that I should be in the teeth of this.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit about, since we've mentioned it, and it's this is what Ossian Weathermere's kind of got up his sleeve. Tell us something to do with this. Tell us a little bit about Cell Narm and how it affects all of this.
Boy.
Without giving anything away, please.
So let's put it like this: the best equivalent I can give not in a sort of sense of physics. I mean, the bottom line is, as we've already said, Selnarm, it travels faster than and it's immediate. It's instantaneous, and it can actually reach over. Usually, it is mostly constrained to operation inside of a given heliosphere, a given system, but there are ways, and this is one of the things that allows the Kaituni to actually dominate almost all of the incoming later waves of the Arduins and turn them into Kaituni, because they figure out something very simple, which is, okay, I can't get a specific message or emotion through, but I can do this. I can turn it on, I can turn it off. And that is the basis of binary or Morse, as the case may go.
Yes, Selnarm isn't exactly telepathy as that is usually understood. It's an empathic sense.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
How is it different than the Force?
In the interest of brevity, let's ask, how is it similar to the Force?
It seems somewhat similar to the Force.
Well, I'm going to say Selnarm has rules. How about that?
Well, that's true. It's not magic.
There you go. See, what I love about Toni is she is tactful yet blunt.
And those rules have a huge part to play in the working out of the story as well.
Yes, as a matter of fact, Selnarm, or leveraging Selnarm against itself, turns out to be one of the tricks that, if you will, the Werner von Braun equivalent, the Arduin scientists who are the equivalent of the Selnarm populators of this world's version of Project Paperclip, actually figure out a way to essentially use Selnarm, because their adversaries have decided, hey, guess what? If we can pilot, we don't need to waste pilots. We put we run fighters essentially from drone command centers. So we can lose any number of machines and they can't do anything to us. We always have an intact group of experienced fighters. And one of the things, without giving it away, is that Ossian's, like I said, his Arduin brain trust figures out a way to, well, let's put it like this. It's a real bitch when they hack your drone.
Just don't leave it at that. Yeah, let's not give any more away than that.
Well, let's step back for a moment. What are you both working on right now? And
But I've mostly been working on.
And you could go ahead and pitch to Toni now that. No, please don't.
Well, what I've mostly been working in lately is a universe dreamed up for my upcoming novel, Her Majesty's American. I also have a short story set in that universe in the Baen anthology Star Destroyers, which is now in the bookstores, and I have another short story in that universe, which is coming out on Baen.com in July. Basically, all this takes place in the 23rd century of an alternate timeline in which the American Revolution was patched up, and as a result, by the 23rd century, we have an interstellar British Empire. However, it has rivals, however, and disgruntled elements. And this is mostly what I've been working on right now. I hope to do a sequel to Her Majesty's American.
Her Majesty's American, I believe, is a September book, and it's really cool. It's got a super cool cover.
Yeah.
By
Yes, that is cool.
The British guy.
Dominic Harmon.
Dominic Harmon, yeah.
Yeah. We had a Brit do your Her Majesty's American cover. So.
And Chuck, what's going on in the Ganniverse?
That sounds as bad as it seems. But at any rate, the thing that's going on right now, to the exclusion of all else, and the only reason that I had any misgivings to hop on the phone today was because I'm concluding the revisions to Mark of Cain, which is the 5th book in the Cain Riordan series, in which I think the easiest way to put it is this is sort of like the Tales of Marco Polo meets Satyricon in space, and at the end of it, the series has pretty much stood on its head 180 degrees. And I'm having a blast writing and revising this book. And it's, every once in a while you write a book and you say, how am I going to work this out? And not this. This one, had there not been other things in my way, this one was very, very easy. And the stuff leading, in many ways, all 4 books, and I think a lot of people will hopefully see this. I think the people who've read the series, many things which have been, so to speak, left on the table. Not as bad as the gun over the fireplace and Hedda Gabler, but or is that a pistol? I can't remember. But at any rate, there are a bunch of, if you will, unanswered, not pressing questions, but, well, how would that have happened? And why is this? In a hard science fiction universe, for instance, just to take one example, why do you have to harken back to something earlier in this conversation, how is it that you have 5 different intelligent species, all in a 150 light-year diameter, who, within about 7,000 years of each other, all come to faster than light travel at the same time? Now, if and you start now, given that this is, let's put it like this: this is as hard science fiction as I know how to write and allow travel between stars. That is not faster than the speed of light, but gets around the speed of light, because if Mother Nature can do that with quantum entanglement, damn it, Chuck Gannon can too.
It's only fair.
So yeah, right. So the thing is that all of those sort of questions, which quite frankly, I've tried to maintain a trip hammer pace in the series, which means that like the characters, I think a lot of readers have said, well, that is kind of unusual, but what the hell? It's not where the action is right now. Well, all of this has been accumulating and building up to something, as they say, and a lot of this, let's put it like this, many, many, many questions get answered in the course of Mark of Cain. However, and anybody who's read one of these books knows, as many more get spawned by those answers. So this is, if I sound enthusiastic, yeah, I'm just not that good an actor. I really am.
It sounds like you've run out of ideas and you're struggling to make it 50,000 words. No.
Right, you're absolutely right. Yeah, it really is.
It sounds great. And what's the title again?
The title is Mark of Cain, where Mark is spelled Marque. Very, very quickly, running over some other things. I don't know, Toni. There's a contract, I believe, heading towards me about my participation in another universe. Is this a good place to announce it, or do I leave that on the down low?
I think, you know how superstitious I am too. Let's leave it for the next the next episode. But
there we go. So now I really have to tune in again to the podcast. See? So there's a secret, spelled SEKRIT, project that you'll hear more about later. I'm finishing up another 1632 novel there, where I'm sort of playing the role of Eric Flint to Robert Waters, and that's called 1637 Calabar's War. Then I spin around and do yet another 1632 thing, the sequel to Commander Cantrell in the West Indies, which is War Beyond the Line, and that's going to be hopefully done, since I've already got 30,000 in the can, sometime by fall latest. And then I do the first book in the fantasy trilogy, called The Broken World. And that one is, I'm really looking forward to writing that one as well. And all I can say is, if you see things in that novel which look like I am leaning on what I would call the tired tropes of, quote, medieval tinctured fantasy, I'm not. They're there for a reason. And I'm going to play a game. So I hope everybody comes along and plays the game with me. So that's sort of that's the short horizon outlook right now.
Sounds cool. As far as the Starfire series goes, this book is just a wonderful culminating sort of climactic moment for this storyline. It's just got all kinds of wonderful, cool action and character moments.
It may be that the last chapter, if I could just say this, because I have to pat my pal on the back here. I think, and I love so much of what Steve has done over the course of this series, but I think his last chapter in this book is arguably my very favorite. And for those of you, don't skip to the end. Just get to it in the richness of time and the fullness of meaning. And I think you'll see what I mean, and I'll bet you may agree with me.
Yeah, it's really, it's moving stuff also.
The whole Starfire series is what I would call hard science fiction within a very soft science fiction framework. And I think that's what I like about it, because this is the sort of thing I like to read as well as to write. And I think it gives the hard science fiction a certain framework, which keeps us honest. And I think that's one of the great strengths of this series. Probably part of the reason it's lasted as long as it has.
It's a great culmination of the storyline, and it's a great part of the series. The book is Oblivion by Steve White and Charles E. Gannon. It's now at booksellers everywhere. Steve and Chuck and Toni and Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us.
It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks for hosting us.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
This is another entry in Alliance of Equals, a Liaden Universe novel by Sharon Lee and Steve Miller. Beset by the angry remnants of the Department of the Interior and challenged at every turn by opportunists on their new homeworld of Surebleak and low on funds, Clan Corval desperately needs to reestablish its position as one of the top trading clans in known space. To this end, Master Trader Sean Galen and Corville's premier trade ship Dutiful Passage is on a mission to establish new business associations and to build a strong primary route that links well with existing loops and secondary routes. But reestablishing trade and preserving the lives of the few remaining members of the clan aren't all of Corval's problem. Matters come to a head as Dutiful Passage, accustomed to being welcomed and feted at those ports on its call list, finds itself denied docking and blacklisting while agents of the DOI mount armed attacks on others of Corval's traders under the very eyes of port security systems. Traveling with Dutiful Trader on this unsettling journey is Paddy O'Scalin, the master trader's heir and his apprentice. Paddy is eager to make up for time lost due to Corval's unpleasantness with the Department of the Interior, but she is also keeping a secret so intense that her coming of age and perhaps her very life is threatened by it. And here is the latest entry in Sharon Lee and Steve Miller's Alliance of Equals.
Customs, the message came across the ship band. We release cameras and inspect. Fools, Dilnem muttered, while Kick, on second, acknowledged the hail. Sent a regular birthday party this time, Kick commented, 3 on scans. Priscilla looked up from her own screen and strode across the bridge to stand behind the pilots. 3, she asked. It's usually only 1. Yes'm. Must be a slow day. Priscilla drew a deep breath, tasting ash and rot. In the screen, the camera pods were released, swarming toward the passage like so many bees. Increase the inner shield, she said sharply. Dilnem threw a startled look over his shoulder, his fingers already moving on the board. Increase inner shield, he said. Yes, Captain. Open a line to the lead cutter, she said. I want to talk to the pilot in charge. Yes, ma'am, said Kick, fingers likewise moving. I'm not getting an ACK on their private frequency. Second try, third. Go to public channels, Priscilla said, stomach tight with sudden panic. Kick touched the switch. Dutiful Passage, the message came loud across the broad beam. You are advised that this increased shielding is inappropriate and against regulations established by the Langlast Port Authority for orbiting vessels. You are advised that shields must be brought down to low-hazard orbital maintenance security level, as per applicable Piloting Regulation 44. If you do not comply with regulations and allow us to complete our inspection, you will be fined and banned from this port. This is a security and safety operation, orders from Shift Director. Public channels, Priscilla said. I will answer. Are we logging this? Yes, Captain, said Dilnem. Broad beam open, ma'am, Kick said. This is Priscilla Delacroix y Mendoza, Clan Corval, Captain of Dutiful Passage out of Surebleak. We see an anomaly. Please explain why there are 3 cutters releasing an increased number of pods than on previous inspections. If a situation has been found that is deemed suspicious, we wish to be notified so that we can work with the Customs Office to resolve the problem. The Customs Office has its protocols and its reasons. Drop the shields to LHOMS level as previously ordered and allow us to continue our inspection. We must establish and ensure that your ship is not a danger to other traffic. Captain, Dilnem said, low-voiced. The drones are proceeding. Priscilla looked to the screen. The drones were indeed proceeding, and there was something about those drones. Ship alert, she said, intuition raising hackles. Crew to general quarters. Dilnem punched the code in, and the 2-tone warning echoed through the ship as the captain's voice raced on. Compare to log. Are those the same drones we've seen before? Cross-check drone and cutter database. Comparing, no match to log, Kick said. The screen inset flickered with matching images adjusted for size, for shape, for purpose. Open! A sharp breath. Different cutter! Attack, pylons! The image flickers stopped, and the inset showed clear IDs. Type match. They're military-grade pods, ma'am. Seed bombers. Dilnem snapped his webbing into place and pulled the seat belt snug. Kick did the same as Priscilla stood resolute behind them. Seed bombers explosively released clouds of small, limpet-like bombs, which would then attach to a ship's hull and explode. No one strike was likely to be fatal, but many small strikes could certainly disable even a large trade ship. The explosive launch easily propelled the bombs through a basic meteor shield like the LHOMS and could even overwhelm medium-hazard shielding. The cutters continued to close slowly, but the drones accelerated, darting toward the passage. "Top shields!" Priscilla snapped, just as the closest robot bomber released its deadly cargo.
That was another entry in the complete audiobook serialization of Alliance of Equals by Sharon Lee and Steve Miller. And that's it for the podcast. Thanks to Audible.com. Thanks to Toni Weisskopf and Jonathan Grauberd for being part of the interview, and the podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz.
And the keys to the secret entrance to Big Ben in London that reveals the tower to be an ancient rocket ship, plus plaudits, thanks, and praise to Steve White and Charles E. Gannon, authors of Oblivion.
Please join us next time, here at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.